Have you ever wondered why your favorite taco is costing you an arm and a leg these days? Or is your dream couch still in back order status for months now? Join us as we go behind the scenes of the global supply chain. Let us discuss and understand its complexity and learn from the industry leaders, professionals, and subject matter experts. Expect in-depth analysis and genuine conversations about the major issues affecting the supply chain today. Welcome to Supply Chain Demystified. Your host is none other than the distinguished supply chain expert, Dr. Nick Valles. Professor Valles is the academic director of USC Marshall Global Supply Chain Management and founding executive director of USC Marshall Randall R. Kendrick Global Supply Chain Institute.
Get on to a couple of key other points I want to share with you, and let's talk about it. Digital transformation. As you know, blockchain, I've written books about blockchains and the supply chains and the role of AI and ML, that's how that's going to play. How do you see technology playing in? Let's start with the big end-to-end supply chain, but then get into maritime industry.
It is going to transform quite the way we operate the supply chain, but this also needs to be seen in a slightly larger context. Information sharing in the supply chain is still at a relatively rudimentary level. Many stakeholders do not provide accurate data. They do not provide timely data. They clearly do not provide them in the same standards and formats. That is a barrier. That is being worked on, and that is gradually going to be resolved. What we are beginning to see the early start of now is the use of sensors. A good example is to look at carriers like Hapag-Lloyd and O&E, who is now in the process of outfitting every single dry container with a live tracker. That will give you a new level of insight into what goes on in the supply chain. You can argue a tracker on a container doesn't give you anything new as long as it sits on the ship. We can already track the ships, but it gives you real-time insight on all the landside movements in both origin and destination. That's only step one. This is what a lot of people are focused on right now. How can we get this insight? Once you get that insight, the next question will then start to come to top of mind. What am I going to use this for? And what people will find is they will be sitting at the wrong end of a fire hose of information. This is where AI then starts to come in. How do we sift through all this data? Because you really don't want all the data. What you want is an intelligent way of finding out when do things no longer go according to plan. We're going to go down a path where as long as things go according to plan, nobody watches the data. You only watch the data once something goes wrong. You want to know that as quickly as possible, ideally predicted. And then you want somebody intelligent or an AI to come up with what is plan B, C, and D. What can I choose? What should I do? That is part of where this is going to move to. That's what we're going to need to use the information for. If you think that a step further down the line, there will be opportunities coming out of this that we don't even think about today. Let me just highlight two things that is likely going to come out of this. Think a few years down the line, you've got live trackers on all the containers. Can I get access to the detailed information? No, that will likely be password protected for the customers only. But just like you sit with your cell phone, I can't see what is on your cell phone, but the phone networks, they can, and they will sell the data in terms of where are units. This is why you have GPSs today in your car that will tell you there's a queue on the road, because that's an intelligent use of data. How is that likely going to be used? One thing it can be used for is increased safety. We got a massive problem with fires on board container ships. Before the pandemic, it was roughly once every 2 weeks there was a major fire on a container ship, often from misdeclared cargo. The shipping line's problem is they are legally barred from opening a sealed container. So if the shipper says this is t-shirts, I have to trust them. With a tracker on, I can suddenly and automatically see somebody picked up an empty container. It stopped at the fireworks factory. Then it arrived at the terminal and the customer says it's t-shirts. Hang on, there might be an issue here. So that would be one of, you can say, the intelligent uses of it, just as an example. but it also creates something else. Again, I will not be able to just read the information on the tracker, but what I might be able to see, again, let's make a hypothetical example. If I was sitting in market intelligence in Adidas, I'd be very interested in seeing how many container trackers show up at manufacturing nodes operated by Nike, for example. I would suddenly get a level of insight, of competitive insight I haven't had before. It's going to be a level playing field for all. They'll all get this information, but it's going to put the pressure on how do you then compete in a world where your supply chain is not as secret as it used to be.
Yeah, but isn't that the barrier or to share the information? I think the supply chain industry is still operates.
But the point with this one is you can do this. Again, that was why I made the example with a cell phone. You are not sharing any information with me, but physically the phone company knows where this is. And they're likely going to sell that data, just as they're selling the data from your cell phone right now for example, traffic jams. It's the same kind of devices you're going to have on the containers. So you won't know who is this container going to and from. You won't know what is in it, but you will know that there is a container. And if I know that suddenly 80 empty containers showed up at this manufacturing unit, that gives me information.
So to that point, Lars, I mean, we are already there, right? If I know, although I'm so happy to hear that the Hapag and UCL, they're actually trying to fit their assets with the sensors. But you do have today the human carrying sensors, which is cell phones. So any touch point along your supply chain that touches your asset, you can ping that cell phone data, XYZ coordinate. So you pretty much know the last person touched it and the next person who's going to be touching it. So that information is already exists. Do you see what last mile consumer facing supply chain, specifically e-commerce and omni-channel, has been able to do? So let's look at the examples of Amazon here has done a tremendous work in terms of predictive and prescriptive analytics for the consumer facing. I mean, it knows that what you need tomorrow and can actually have inventory close to your location and get it fulfilled within 6 hours. Do you think the maritime industry is open and capable of driving that level of insight and open to possibilities using digital transformation as a means?
The short answer is no, and also that's not their role in the supply chain. Because the maritime part of the supply chain is quite a few steps removed from the consumer. So a lot of this in the maritime supply chain is not about providing data to the consumer, to the endpoint, because no consumer is buying an entire container full of shoes, for example. I'm only buying one pair of shoes. So the maritime part of the supply chain, their interface is with the companies that provide that last mile. It is with the companies that handle the distribution, that handle the cross-load, the cross-loading. Those are the takeovers. Then, of course, you do have some, for example, container carriers that now want to be end-to-end, and absolutely, but that still means that the maritime component, the users of that data, the users of that information will have to be the entities that then deal with the last mile. The consumers also in the future will basically have no touch points with the containers themselves, because that is not the unit that they're buying.
Very good. So I think you see this as more so working with the terminal operators, the drayage and the movements from the port terminals to the distribution or whatever the drayage route may be. That's the maximum obligation that you feel the maritime industry has.
Exactly, because the better I'm able to provide the information, the better the land-based guys are to say, okay, fine, we know this ship is coming in. We know the drayage operator should then arrive at this point in time and have all these other things lined up. That's part of the problem today, because you don't have that transparency. That's why you end up with tens of thousands of containers stuck for weeks in a terminal, and you really don't want that in a terminal. You want flow, you don't want to wait.
So let's talk about one of the things we want to demystify, because this question arises about the fueling of the vessel. Help me and our audience understand, is this like the vessel leaves one terminal and let's say it's calling multiple ports? Is there a sophistication or algorithmically it makes a decision where the cheapest fuel and at what point to refuel and make those decisions, or this is not an issue in the shipping industry?
No, to some degree, that some of the shipping lines have been doing this for quite a number of years already, having models in place in terms of how much fuel consumption do I have, how much fuel do I want to have on board, what is the fuel price at various bunkering locations, and trying to optimize that one. That has been going on for quite a number of years. Some of especially the large liners are pretty sophisticated, both in terms of how do you then plan for your bunkering operations, but also down to the point where some of them have quite literally operations room where I think you can picture the kind of room with a global map filling up an entire end wall, small dots showing exactly where hundreds of ships are, with computers calculating what is the optimal route for each and every ship, taking into account not only which ports they're going to, what are the predicted weather patterns, what are the ocean currents, to try to optimize. So to some degree, for some of the larger carriers, this is already being done. The trick is not to have the best possible computers do this. The trick is to ask yourself, how do you then handle all the exceptions? Because the computer will only know the data, but the computer might not have all the relevant data. There might be local conditions where the captain will say, I'm not going to follow this path because the weather is actually not exactly as the computer thinks it is. So I am going to do something else. Or it might be a commercial decision. The commercial decision being, well, I actually have this customer. He's so important to me, so let's speed up the ship to get it to port earlier. Or it might be the other way around, say, yeah, we know we're going to delay the customers a couple of days, but on balance, we would rather save the fuel. These are some of the human decisions. So you have the machines in there to tell you mathematically, given the data we have, what is the optimal solution. And then you have the human element saying, that's great, but when do we choose to override this? When do we either make a choice that is not optimal seen from the computer's perspective, but we might have other criteria involved here as well?
And these are obviously, I'm assuming, these are all live data and decision being made on a spontaneous basis.
Yeah, and you can say this is where there's still room for improvement going forward. I mean, it's not unusual that carriers would cancel a sailing. That's part of capacity management. But what are the ripple effects of this? If I cancel a sailing, let's say I cancel a sailing going from Jakarta up to Singapore. Okay, but that cargo that now needs to move from Jakarta up to Singapore, where does that go? It might go to Tanjung Pelepas. It goes on another ship where it then takes up space where I might block for cargo I was supposed to take up in Sri Lanka, and so on. So it's a huge ripple effect every time you make a small change. And that is where we are still in early days, where again, AI is likely going to help us a couple of years down the line in better understanding when I make this decision. A practical thing could be my ship is approaching a port. And the port is just saying, well, we got a typhoon warning. So either you skip the port or you're going to wait for 2 days. What's the best option here? If I wait for 2 days, everything gets delayed, I get all the ripple effects, but at least the cargo gets off in the right port. Or I can just skip the port, everything else will be fine, but now I have to reroute the cargo I took off. There's a huge number of ramifications. That again is where some of the digitalization is going to help make better decisions.
Absolutely. So just to translate that into somewhat simple speak, as we often drive around the highways and neighborhoods, and we would make decision to fuel at some station versus the other. Cost is a huge variable, and convenience probably just second. The maritime industry, the vessel operators, would actually make the same decision. If they know that I'm going to call Panjatapal is PTP or going to Singapore, but the PTP, my fuel bunker cost is 20% cheaper, I'd much rather refuel there versus at the Port of Singapore.
Yeah.
And so those decisions, you think that they're already been modeled and there's a high level of
At least for some of the
sophistication.
major container lines, they do have this kind of modeling and this sophistication. I would not speak for all container lines. I would not necessarily assume that's the case when you get to some of the smaller and medium-sized ones.
That's just fascinating. We're coming to a close here, but what is the future holds for maritime industry? What excites you? What are the top 3 things you think that's going to occur that you think will shape or reshape our maritime industry?
Some of the things that's going to be interesting, it operates on different timescales. Let's look at the very short timescale. What I find to be extremely fascinating, I'm seeing a breakup in the alliance structures that we know. And we're going to get a reshaping. It's not the first time. I mean, the alliances do get reshaped every so often. That is happening now again here in 23 and 24. That's going to be extremely interesting to see how that one plays out. At the opposite end of the time scale, you got this whole decarbonization. How is that going to play out? Realistically, this is going to take at least 25, 30 years before that journey is complete. There's a lot of voices out there that would love to see this go faster. That would be nice, but there's also the physical realities of it takes time to build ships. It takes time to build the manufacturing capabilities for the fuel. So realistically, it's going to take longer than people like. And then on the time scale in between, what we talked about here, all the new digital opportunities, what are we going to do when we turn on the fire hose of data? And I'm going to be really excited because much as we can sit here and come up with ideas of what could this data be used for, I'm willing to bet that there are also things we haven't even thought of. Once the data is there, then suddenly there's all these additional elements that come up. Maybe a bit counterfactual. I mean, when Steve Jobs were launching the first iPhones, I would guess that nobody at that time thought that would help you on your way to work with a GPS, rerouting you around traffic jams. But that was, again, one of the ramifications.
Oh, excellent. So to that point, so you talked about the pretty bright future, reshaping of alliances, decarbonizations, and the digital transformations and maritime timescale. What's the one thing that keeps you awake about the maritime industry that
the one thing everybody should be the most concerned about, also because I'm still not sure everybody takes it serious, that is the cyber risk, the risk of a cyber attack. And I am less concerned about a cyber attack against a container line. We have seen multiple of those over the last 10 years, including the one on Maersk. That can be to some degree managed. What really has me concerned would be a concerted cyber attack successful against, let's say, 5 to 10 of the largest container ports in the world. Even if the ports are well prepared, it might take you up to a week to get back up and running. And if you, let's say, stop a lot of those ports for a week, the congestion you've seen the last 2 years will be child's play compared to what this would then cause.
So you're saying we can actually man-made, without COVID, can create a COVID chaos by just bringing down some of the major terminals.
Yes.
Excellent. And you realize, I think, the seriousness of those kind of an attack. You talk about halting the entire global trade and global economy.
Yes, it's going to have a significant impact. So the risk should not be underestimated, and everybody that operates those kinds of facilities, this has to be, if not at the very top, then almost at the very top of all the priorities that they look at.
Yeah, and it's funny, Lars, you brought that up because last few weeks ago when I did a keynote in Miami, the question came up, but why don't we just have extra inventory, what we call just in case? And I said, there is no way we as a humanity can build just in case scenario for every possible disruption.
No.
Right.
And there's also another one, because coming out of COVID, there are some proponents say, well, now we have extra buffers in the supply chain. We need to have that. Well, here's what's going to happen. Nobody's going to have extra inventory. Let's say I'm importing T-shirts into the US, and I'll say, I learned my lesson. I need larger inventories because things can happen. Then somebody else will look at my business and say, look at that old geezer. He has a very inefficient supply chain. I'm going to start importing T-shirts with a much more lean supply chain. I can sell my T-shirts at a cheaper price. So no, all the buffers that came into the supply chain during COVID, they will all be eradicated again.
Absolutely. And supply chain, I always say they're very resilient, and you'll always sort of find the state of equilibrium. So the excess inventory built for, let's say, COVID will actually absorb itself, and then we'll come right back to the balanced inventory levels across all the nodes within the supply chain.
And that's what we talked about in the very beginning of this as well. You can either choose to see these last 2 years as a huge cost, or you can choose to see, if you look over the last 20 years, how much did you save in the first 18 years by not having those buffers versus how much did it cost you in the last 2? On balance, you're better off than paying for a disruption once in a blue moon.
All right, so let's now take a philosophical view of our technical conversations. But so you feel the last 40 years of what I have called the 4 decades of peaceful global trade, what is the probability in your world and your view that will continue for next 4 decades?
You will continue to see ever more global trade, but it's going to be more diversified. It's going to be much more complex. We've been used to these, I was about to say, almost binary supply chain, move from China to US, move from China to Europe. This is going to be much more of a complex web rather than these singular pipelines that we've been looking at.
Right. So it doesn't matter. I've been calling it decouplings. You can call it de-risking, diversifying, but those would be the future. So we at least agree on the fact that the world will no longer be on the long linear string of supply chain that we design and build for 4 decades, but it will be a complex web of multiple nodes serving multiple community. And I honestly, Lars, my view, it's more so grounded in the principle of single dimensional supply chain of cost only, cost centric and profit centric, to move away from this triple bottom line models that we can design and build as much as we can in terms of the resilience, the efficiency, and the sustainability. And I think if we model for those things, and we as a consumer, we're the starting point, then it rolls all the way up to the board of directors, where they hold all the key stakeholders, and we actually create this sort of a humanity-based network of consciousness. I think we can leave the planet behind for future generations that becomes a happier place for hundreds of thousands of years, not just 100 years or 2,000 years that we tend to model for.
Yep.
Lars, it's such a pleasure. I'm so happy that we had a chance to connect. I'm going to leave the last words for you to our audience about anything or an important message that you would like to close our session.
No, I think that the main part is, again, to maybe marvel at what the supply chain is from the fact just how versatile and resilient it is. We talked about, did the supply chain break here during the pandemic? Let's also keep in mind, despite all the challenges in the pandemic, more cargo was moved than ever before in history.
Well said, Lars. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. For more demystifying supply chain insights, subscribe to Supply Chain Demystified podcast. Until next episode, be well, and I'll see you all soon. Lars, once again, thank you very much. Safe travel, and hopefully one of these days, I look forward to seeing you in person. Take care.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for the next demystifying discussion on the supply chain. Visit uscsupplychain.com to stay up to date on all things supply chain.